Welcome to Raw and Real is Powerssquared Raw and Real. This is number 18. I'm M.A. Powers.
And I'm JL Powers.
And I'm coming to you from yucky, wintry Maine again.
I think you just have to get used to that. I cannot claim that it's wonderful, lovely weather here in California, but probably comparatively speaking, it's better than what you've got.
Well, we were super happy on Friday because it got up to like 55 degrees and was sunny. So we went to the ocean.
Woohoo! We would consider that a little cold, but yeah.
No, bike riding and ocean. So that was a lot of fun. Well, today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about a new book that you are finishing up. Final edits here, and then also, but first, before we talk about the new book, I want you to tell us a little bit about the original book, because this is a follow-up book. It's not a sequel exactly. It is a sequel, but it's a follow-up book more than just like another book. So the original book is This Thing Called the Future. Tell us a little bit about This Thing Called the Future, and also what I'm really interested in is what were you doing when you wrote that book and kind of the process of writing it? And we'll talk about how that compares to writing this follow-up book. All right?
Okay. So when I wrote This Thing Called the Future, I had just recently left my PhD program at Stanford. And when I was at Stanford in my PhD program, which, by the way, was an amazing PhD program, and the fact that I left it had nothing to do with the program or my wonderful advisors. It just that academic life didn't fit for me. But I was in an African history class or African history major for my PhD, and I really sort of never imagined that I would write a fictional novel set in Africa for a lot of reasons. My first novel was set on the US-Mexico border, The Confessional, and that was because we grew up there. So I felt perfectly comfortable. I mean, that was my home culture. And so even though you and I are not Mexican by birth or by genetics, the factor of absolutely having been immersed in the Mexican American and Mexican cultures from very early ages throughout, all of my early adulthood until moving to California, around the time I was 30, it felt like home culture to me, and it was exactly. It was just what I knew, and so it didn't feel transgressive in any way, and I didn't feel like, especially coming from a scholarly background, I was so aware of, the problem of outsiders coming and, writing about the African and things like that, as if you could have a monolithic African stand in for all Africans, or just getting things fundamentally wrong, or having this kind of superior attitude. And so I never dreamed, the scholarly project and the academic project is so different, and it comes from such a different place than trying to embody a character fictionally, where you're really trying to, explore that person's experiences from the inside out. And the academic project is so from without and from outside, and it has that outsider perspective.
So you left the PhD program.
So I left the PhD program, and then I just felt like I needed to write this book. I was, I had been staying with a Zulu family to learn the Zulu language.
Which incidentally is a funny story all in itself, since you got in contact with that Zulu family. I think from my PhD program, I have a few. Nope, this is totally different. Oh, that was a Zulu family. That was a different family. Okay, that's a totally different story.
Yes, that is a totally different story. Anyway, and I felt absolutely kind of compelled to write this story about what it must be like to grow up as a young woman in an environment saturated with HIV/AIDS, where sexual violence was also so common and so frequent. And I think statistics at the time that I read indicated that about, over 60% of young women's first sexual experiences in South Africa were violent and not,
Right.
and coercive. And, that's a very high percentage, especially in a country where HIV/AIDS was so, prominent. And so I just felt compelled to write this story. And it's a coming of age story of a young woman who, just as her mother starts dying of HIV, or dying of AIDS, she starts falling in love for the first time. And she also, receives this call to be a Sangoma, but she loves science too. And so she's trying to navigate the modern world of figuring out how can she love science, but also hear the voices of her ancestors.
So describe a Sangoma would be like a traditional healer.
A traditional healer, and they would combine like herbal healing with divination. So they would, like if you visit Sangoma, that Sangoma will seek to connect with your ancestors to find out what is wrong with you. And
all right, so at this time, so you were writing this book, you had finished your PhD. Did you have a child yet? You were living in Northern California.
My child, no, I wrote it all before having Nesta. Now, I did some revisions on it after Nesta was born. So it was published after he was born, when he was about 5 or 6 months old. So I did some revisions on it.
And you were teaching English, right, at the time?
I was teaching English. I was doing some consulting work and writing, and really trying to prioritize writing in a way that I've never been able to do since.
Right. And so this thing called The Future, which is it's a exciting book in terms, especially for Americans, because you get a real window into a world that none of us, or very few of us, will have ever experienced. And it's both lyrical and exceedingly well written. And so you had the time, you had the desire, and you had the priority of writing that first book. So tell us a little bit about the second book, which I have read, and and at least I've read a version of it. I enjoyed it exceedingly. In fact, there are parts of it that I liked because of the fast-pacedness. It's not fast-paced in a certain way, but things really get going right away and really go. Of course, I'm a sucker for that kind of thing, but it still has that same beautiful lyricism and the way the characters speak and the way that they interact and flow with each other, and yet it's totally different. So tell us a little bit about this next book coming up without giving too much away, and also what you were doing while you were writing the second book.
Okay, well, let's see if I can remember all of this. So with the first book, I took a lot of time with that book, and I, really just dived into things in a way that I haven't been able to do it since. But things also changed because I dived into that book so much and spent so much time in South Africa and learning Zulu, learning speech patterns of English language Zulu the English language speech patterns of native Zulu speakers, and really trying to understand how Zulus perceive the world and medicine and health and healing and the ancestors and all of those things. This second book was able to come perhaps a lot more easily without having to do, and because I just keep going back to South Africa, and now it feels very much like a second home to me, a home away from home. But I had to write this one on the fly a lot more. And that may be partly what's reflected in it's a little more fast-paced, perhaps.
But it has a freedom. I'm saying it's a fast-paced, but it has a I feel it has a freedom to it that you probably don't realize when you're trying to write it, because writing never necessarily feels free at the time. It's like riding a bicycle on over the Alps. There's sometimes it goes really fast and it's fun, but there's a lot of times where it's really hard because you got to get, up those massively steep hills.
Yeah, well, this was more like lots and lots of humps, I guess, because I wrote a few chapters and then didn't write anything for a long time, a year or two, while we were working on our books, or book that's out, and let's not talk about the book that has never seen beyond the 75 or 80 pages.
Right. And if there's any writers out there who are listening to this, I just want to point out that like the way we write is against everything that any writer will ever like describe how you should write, and yet it's done. It's there. It's out there. We have huge gaps between chapters or even paragraphs, whereas most professional writers will indicate that you should be consistent in doing it every day, which is probably ideal. So don't take that away.
Totally ideal.
But don't give up. But don't give up.
Yeah, don't give up. No, I mean, that's the way I used to write before I had a child. I wrote every day for several hours. And because of that, I had that time and that intensity that I think feels like I'm very connected with this thing called the future. I'm very, very connected to underwater too, but I didn't have that time. I no longer have the luxury of that time.
And yet as a reader, it feels so free in a way. And maybe that's because you don't have the luxury of time to agonize over every little thing. And so sometimes you just have to just keep moving. Well,
I sent it with a lot of trepidation to two good friends of mine. One of them is Futi Nitshingila, who is Zulu and grew up in Mbali Township, which is where this book is set. And she's the writer of We Kiss Them with Rain, which I published through Catalyst Press recently. And then I also sent it to my good friend Gugu Mafoking, who is the director of this organization called Whiz Kids that connects soccer and health. And she lives in Mbali Township now and has for years, grew up there, etc. And she works with kids that are the age of my protagonist. And both of them absolutely loved it. And I was like, just so relieved. Not only that they loved it, but that they're like, okay, yeah, no, we got to get this book to kids here, which said so much to me, because this thing called the future, I spent so much time agonizing over every detail and making sure, like, was this authentic? And, and I just didn't have the time quite to do that with Underwater, which so I was like, please read this and, tear it apart if it needs to be torn apart. I really need your honest opinion. And I was just so relieved. But I think because I have now immersed myself for so long, for 13 years in that culture and that community, it just came a lot more naturally than the first book. But yeah, during this time, these 7 years between this thing called The Future coming out and Underwater, I've been continuing to teach. I became a mother. I've never put Nesta in daycare, and I'm homeschooling him. So he's in first grade now. I launched a publishing company. I'm publishing African writers and African-based literature, some very time-intensive work, including graphic novels. I work for Cinco Puntos Press. In fact, I started working for Cinco Puntos Press. I had worked for them before going to the PhD program. And then around the time Nesta was a baby. I sometimes confuse the two of you. Either I feel very sisterly towards Nesta or very motherly towards you. I'm not sure which. Both. I started working for Cinco Puntos again, and then you and I started writing together, and you know, so it's just been a real maelstrom of like work, and it definitely feels overwhelming at times, but also exhilarating.
Yeah, and I think the upshot that I want to just point out, because I think it's good for all of us to remember, is that when you have, you shouldn't let all of life just make you get so discouraged that you just quit whatever it is that you're doing, because if it's a project that can be ongoing, just realize it can continue, and you can pick up and you can continue to move forward. And I'm looking forward to seeing the final version of Underwater, and having it be published, which hopefully will be about a year in January.
In January, yeah, not too far away.
Well, great. Well, our 15 minutes is up. Is there anything else you want to conclude to besides me throwing in my 2 cents?
Yeah, no, I just want to say I really agree with that. Like some projects take, I mean, in one sense, I feel like I didn't take the time with this book that I took with this thing called The Future, but it's been 7 years since this thing called The Future was published.
Sure.
I think I have taken time with it. It's just presented itself differently than that initial book. And so I think sometimes, yeah, let's go with the flow and don't feel bad, and recognize that, you know, you can't always do the things that you might have done 10 years ago the same way that you're doing it now. You have to change things.
Right. And that doesn't make it worse or better either. It's something you just have to deal with life.
Life has its realities, you know, and that's okay.
And that sometimes forces you into situations that turn out to be very good too. Just
that was really profound. Life has its realities, and that's okay. Maybe we should end with that.
That was good. That sounds excellent.
Right. So this is Powerssquared, coming to you with Raw and Real number 18, and we will see you next week.
Unless life gets in the way. Right. Realities. All right. Bye.
Bye.